All right, we're back with part two of our conversation with Michael Lind, uh, me, Mike Hartman, and Dan Schmidt doing the conversing, questioning, and we're learning from Michael Lind. We were at the end of part one talking about the politicization of philanthropy. Michael, is it bipartisan? Is it cross ideological politicization of philanthropy, or is one side more politicized than the other, or is this a problem writ large? And we'll then get to what can perhaps be done about it.
Well, now as in the past, the philanthropic money overwhelmingly goes to the left and center left. That's just always been the case. It just dwarfs what goes to the right. And it's kind of a superabundance of resources because at this stage, what was called the adversary culture in the 80s and 90s, now the hegemonic culture. It's the dominant culture in corporate boardrooms and universities, in investment banks. We see this with their endorsement of all kinds of so-called woke positions on everything, boycotts of states whose voters elect the wrong politicians. And so you economically punish, using the tools of capitalism, you economically punish the voters for voting the wrong way. I think going forward, and the resistance for this, much of it's going to have to come from the right and from Republicans, who increasingly represent disenfranchised, disempowered, working class people and people with traditional values who don't necessarily have to be working class. But I think there's a trade-off between agenda promoting and institution building. And so institution building, that's a long-term, multi-decade investment. And you have to give a lot of latitude to the grantees. And you also want membership-based organizations, if you can have them, so that, for example, the Federalist Society is probably the most successful investment that conservative philanthropy made in the 20th century. And that's because you have chapters and they have membership and people feel ownership of it. It's not simply that you're going back to the well in New York or San Francisco or whatever, to get your grant renewed once a year. Because I can tell you, having spent a couple of decades in the NGO world, if you give a grantee a year-long grant, half of the time they will work on the purpose of that grant, 6 months. The other half, they're getting ready to make the next ask, right? Because they're panicking. So I think you have to play the short-term game and the long-term game. And the short-term game of just blocking bad policies in government, that's why we have political parties. Okay, the long-term game, I think the nonprofit sector can play a role there. The political parties cannot, right? The parties have to win the next election. That's what they're focused on. They're not thinking about, higher education in 2035, right? Or like what are, the basic, family policies in the welfare state that you want, in the 2040s and 2050s. So as I say, there's a trade-off. And if you get too close to the parties, not only are you pushing their message, which may not be your message necessarily, but also you're not building these long-term institutions which are bringing people in who are really dedicated and they feel like they own the institution. It's some of these are think tanks, which can only think if they don't have to go week by week from whatever, in the case of the right, the RNC wants to do that week, right? You have a certain amount of distance. Some of them are membership organizations, like the Federalist Society. There are organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America on the left, and that shows you the DSA as a membership organization has actually had more influence on the agenda of the Democratic Party in recent years than a lot of, for all I know, better funded left-leaning NGOs, which are the conventional model where you have the donor, then you have the experts, and the activists and so on. So I'm very big on membership organizations.
Michael, may I ask you, with respect again to your comments, very interesting, and having read as well an interview you did in the just recently in the Texas Monthly, where you had some very interesting comments, much along the lines of what you've just been saying. Do conservative funders, do you think, given the general sort of decline or decrease in legitimacy with respect to the experts, the managers, other institutions, and the trust that once was held, perhaps just as a sort of fact of life, with perhaps that also in decline, do conservative donors really, as you point out, need to take that long view in particular? They can't really think of themselves as day traders, or will measure the balance sheet at the end of the month, which seems to have been sort of a viral issue, both sides, left and right, but certainly more so for the right since the 80s. Do conservative donors face a little bit of the problem of with this trust issue and legitimacy, if you think that also is a problem? The sort of problem of the Narodniki in 19th century Russia, where all the young people, educated well, most of them sons and daughters of teachers and bureaucrats, went out into the field with the peasants and tried to convince them of the importance of social science thinking by people like Marx and Plekhanov and another. So is the task one really worth taking, because it is countercultural, but something that the right, or conservatives, I should say, have to adjust their vision on, as you say, both a short game, but really the long game in terms of restoring confidence with the people of everyday life?
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. I would advocate a different strategy for conservative donors now than in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, because the goal of supporting these magazines, including the National Interest, which I was executive editor, was to show the flag in elite institutions, right? It's to show, it's what Bill Buckley did so brilliantly, that conservatives are not just ignorant yahoos, right? They can debate the best, Ivy League and Oxford and Cambridge scholars on their own terms. And that was very important to demonstrate, that, because there was, even then in the 40s and 50s and 60s, this idea that conservatives were just provincials, who are going to be erased by history. And so to have a Buckley and Irving Kristol, these powerful intellectuals, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who had, so there it was all about getting establishment credibility. I think that's over now. There is nothing that center-right people can do which will prevent them from being purged by universities and the media. I mean, it's just, that's the case, right? They're no longer open to debate. And they're no longer open to debate from the Marxist left, unless you fit into this kind of narrow, woke, neoliberal, progressive viewpoint, you're just not welcome. So that leaves political power ultimately as the one thing that working class people, and particularly working class conservatives, have is the vote. And this makes a lot of libertarian conservatives uncomfortable, right? Because you say, well, you can't use, the state, because we've been arguing against the state, to change the culture. But at this point, the enemies of conservatism own every institution in society. They own the corporations, they own the hedge funds, they own the banks and so on. The only institutions in which conservatives have even some voice are particularly legislatures, state legislatures and Congress, not so much the executive branch. The federal judiciary is very elite and not terribly sympathetic. I know I sound like I'm contradicting myself, saying you shouldn't be too partisan, but you should build institutions. But historically, movements succeed with what Bernard Crick, great British political philosopher, called extra-parliamentary institutions. These form a base from which you can take over the party or you can influence the party. It's not the party itself. The reason these extra parliamentary institutions are important is because the extra parliamentary institutions are playing the long game, right? They want a party or both parties to be responsive to them. But if they lose, they're going to change their tune, right? So in the US, in the populist movement was based in the Farmers Alliance and in the range. The labor movement always had an independent identity in the trade unions, distinct from, it was nonpartisan in the 20s and 30s. And then later, even when it leaned towards the Democrats, it had its own base, right? Its own membership, its own funding, all of that. So I don't know what the answer is, but in my book, The New Class War, I talk about the disempowerment of much of the working class in the US comes from the disintegration of these intermediate organizations, some of which conservatives like churches, some of which they don't necessarily like trade unions. So I think you can have an inside and outside game. So the inside game is you can still try to influence debate, although I think at this point it's kind of like being the rabbi in a medieval, disputation in the Catholic Church.
A Thomistic rabbi.
But you need to build up, particularly city level and neighborhood level organizations. I remember years ago, a German was impressed at all of the local associations and like why we had independent think tanks and all of that. And he said, well, in Germany, if something goes wrong, nobody does anything. They expect the government to fix it, right? So if there's a pothole in your street, the neighbors don't form a committee. They just wait. And if it's never fixed, then it's never fixed. And I worry that the US is becoming like that kind of top-heavy elitist society where people just think, even our own community, right? Even our own neighborhood, our own city, our own county, this is not something where we have any power. I find my students, who are very bright students, they're kind of representative of the younger generation. There's an impulse that if there's any problem in the local community, then the federal government should fix it. Congress should pass a law. The federal government should spend money and so on. And so I asked them, well, why don't you see if you can raise some money from local community organizations and if there's a bike lane that needs to be made or something like that. One of my pet peeves, by the way, is when people say our infrastructure is suffering because there's not enough money in the highway trust fund for the highways. There's plenty of money in the highway trust fund for the highways. If you used the highway trust fund, which is based on gasoline taxes, only for interstate highways, it would run a surplus, or at least it would balance the budget. It's because Congress has thrown in mass transit and thrown in bike trails and things like that, which are inherently local. So I think one of the things that philanthropy can do is offer, and I would do this as matching grants. You want them to have skin in the game. For example, I know one community organization that requires that 60% of the chapters come from members. That's a requirement, otherwise no chapter. So the members, you got to put skin in the game. You got to take some money out of your own pocket, and then you can go to foundations and to individual donors.
Well, okay. Why don't we finish up there with that note of advice and guidance? And thanks so much, Michael Lind, for giving us the time to talk today.
Thank you.